Mate, I've written this thing. I haven't posted it yet, but I say to the people who come to my website, I say this. The most important thing you're going to read today is the piece that Hedley Thomas has written in the Australian newspaper. And at the risk of sounding like I'm giving a little bit of a speech to you, I'll tell you what else I say. That in the early days when reporting on this AWU matter was either met with you lose your job, or it was met with derision and scorn, and people laugh at you and say, oh, it's the truth, mate, you're not even that conspiracy crowd, are you? In the early days, that was hard to report against. I reckon what you're doing now is even harder and more important. And I view it this way, Hedley, that at the moment, the message you've got in your piece today is up against entrenched acceptance that, well, this is just the way it is now, Prime Minister makes phone calls and decisions get made, and that's just the way it's going to be. And, go down the shopping mall, get the shopping, or hit the remote control and watch a different channel. That's the way we are. And I just so admire what you wrote today, but more than that, I think there's a next bit to it, and I'd love your views on it, that it's the continuation of it. And mate, I'm really looking to you to sort of, a little bit of leadership in getting us to accept that what happened during Gillard's time was an aberration. It can't happen again.
Michael, look, thanks. I recall well the intimidation and the spooked vibe that was in the media in late 2011 after that late August 2011 backlash by the Prime Minister against Glenn Milne, and then indirectly against yourself over the initial pretty tame reporting of her involvement in the slush fund affair. And I remember it because I was attempting to put it together myself from Brisbane, and I do have to admit that I felt intimidated too, and because I didn't have a very good grasp of the detail, and because the matters were so old, and because I don't think the material was well structured and well presented, and I was not across it well. All of that sort of feeds into I suppose, a bit of a default in people, or it can when there's a strong political figure making all sorts of demands at the same time. It feeds into a bit of a willingness to look the other way, to be perhaps willfully blind or intellectually dishonest. And I think that went a long way to ensuring that the story maintained its kind of, don't go there, too difficult, no doubt wrong status until mid last year, when I tried to pick it up again, spurred on only by Robert McClelland's, well, not only by, but largely spurred on by Robert McClelland's speech in federal parliament, which I didn't have any forewarning about. And I think a nagging concern I had that this story had been buried improperly. And you're now saying that the issues that I addressed in that piece today are powerfully important going forward, and I have a sort of a leadership role to ensure that. Well, you may be right. I think you can only bang that drum. I can only bang that drum so many times, and I think that it's going to be incumbent on others who have the resources and a role to play to do their bit too. And I think that some of my peers in the media have been found wanting on this, and I want to sort of, I guess, be persuaded that when I hear the great speeches about the need to repulse government interference and the concerns about freedom of speech, I want to actually know, when I hear those, that it's not empty rhetoric, that it actually means something, and that when people such as yourself and Glenn Milne and the Australian newspaper and News and Fairfax and so on are monstered for attempting to report the story, that will be actually backed up by our peers because it's fundamentally important.
Mate, I can crystallise this a bit, make it a little bit finer sort of focus. The fact that a Prime Minister with personal interests to protect, not security, not national security, nothing to do with the country's interests, purely personal, can extort with menaces, guarantees and retractions of stories and stuff like that, purely and simply on the positional power that she exercises. The fact that she can do that, and that as a result of that, blokes lose their jobs, people don't write stories, people retract stories and stuff like that. The fact that all that can happen and Australia's media thinks it's unremarkable, they supported it and didn't arc up against it. That's the problem, I reckon, that has to be tackled. And what you've done today is to stick the flag up the pole and say, right, well, look, here's the Hedley Thomas reputation, professional capability and what have you, and I stand for this nation understanding what happened there. And I get the sense from what you wrote today, mate, that you would like to see others have the old red light above the head blink on and say, Ruth, he's right, And that's what I think is a more difficult task than the immediately courageous or whatever, publish and be damned in the heat of the moment. The more difficult task is the sustained one, to recognise we've got this problem in Australia, that we've allowed an incurious and, side-taking media culture to pervade the whole fourth estate. And we've got to fix it. We've got to recognise it and turn it around. Is that a summation you'd subscribe to?
Well, a couple of things that I don't entirely agree with you on there. I don't believe that there's that attitude that pervades the whole media, as you said. I differ on that. I think that... Well,
can we just test that for a second? I'm sorry to jump in there. But if that's right, that it doesn't pervade the whole media, then you would expect in a normal distribution curve of, personalities, that at the time Glenn Milne gets the flick in the morning, and then, a few days later, I get put in the circumstance where I go too, and retractions are run and stories are pulled and stuff like that. Surely to God there'd be someone who'd stand up and volubly make a stand at that time, and no one did. That's the really disturbing thing.
I think my view is that what was going on at that time quite shell-shocked media executives and editors, and by extension journalists. And I think, as Media Watch said at the time, there was a prevailing view that very grave errors of judgment and of fact had been committed by the journalists in question, and that was therefore used as the justification for loss of column, loss of job, that sort of thing.
And no one checked? No journalist was sufficiently curious?
Well, there were... I don't think that's the whole story, but I think that what we have since discovered from a lot of the material that we put into the public arena in the Australian through documents provided by Slater and Gordon's former equity partner Nick Stein-Brown and others, including documents that had been kept for a long time by the former national head of the AWU in Cambridge, now Fair Work Commissioner. What we've put into the public arena as a result of that material shows that the response by the Prime Minister and her office in August 2011 to what I think was very innocuous handful of paragraphs by Glenn Milne and an unbroadcast story by you at that time that had just simply been previewed was an extraordinarily disproportionate response. A disproportionate response by the Prime Minister, because what subsequently came out and is pretty much uncontested and is fraud investigation was so much more weighty and potentially concerning than the snippet of information that the then Prime Minister protested so strongly about. So I think it's taken some time to actually pull out the relevant material. But I also believe that now that that material has been out there, and it's been out there for more than a year now, it is shameful that a number of very senior people in the media and in academia and elsewhere,
and in both, in the same person,
have failed to actually properly analyse these issues and call it for what it was.
Mate, that's exactly the point, that the failure is a failure to analyse, to assess material, to form an opinion, an independent opinion that's based on your own analysis and your own application of logic. I reckon that's one of the fundamental structural changes in the media in particular, probably in society as a whole, that a lot of the commentary about this AW thing has been from people who say, I've checked all the material, I've read all the reports, and there's nothing there. And what they're talking about is having read newspaper articles and stuff like that, not gone to source documents, which is the characteristic that distinguishes a lot of your work, Hedley, from the work of others. And I know you, so I know the days spent in libraries and it's just poring over documents day in and day out to get to the story that others want concealed. Now, the fact that we have people in opinion leadership type positions who are terribly influential, and that we've allowed those positions to become entrenched on the basis of feeling and, televisuality, or whatever you want, looking good on the telly or sounding good on the radio, really that's a real problem we've got to recognise, and talk about and see what we do to fix it.
Well, look, I agree with most of that. I mean, I'm concerned that the political tribe that people belong to appears to strongly influence their writing in the media, their journalism, and their opinions about others' journalism.
Absolutely.
And, I should state, Michael, that although I regard you, correct me if I'm wrong, as a very strongly committed conservative commentator, I'm not a political warrior for either side. And
I just think it's irrelevant in my case, Hedley. I don't think of myself as being a certain pigeonholed thing, therefore every action will be predictable. I'm bloody, Maureen's son, and I've changed.
No, I know, but that's the perception of you by others, which is also important. That's how others perceive you, and that's and so I'm saying that as a caveat for my point that many of the people who have attacked you so vociferously from the other side of the political fence see you that way, and so it becomes like a war of the ideology rather than a contest and test of facts.
That's why I set that website up, to exactly that thing, for exactly that purpose, to rather than to write, what has been the practice in newspaper journalism, to write, I viewed FOI documents and I therefore put this narrative out on my, what can only be affected by yourself as the writer. I put all the source documents out on my website and a spreadsheet that includes 1,100 entries that particularises each document. And I would challenge anybody to go through that and arrive at a view other than that, there's smoke, there's dead set fire here. And still, people don't, they...
Yeah, and it's also, Michael, I think, and this is deeply disappointing, that because the label, shock jock, is quite easily attached to commercial radio broadcasts. In the media, in the mainstream media, or in the serious end of the mainstream media, there's a a bit of a sort of look down your nose, kind of sneering dismissal of the work of shock jocks is unfair. It's not right, because the work that we did in this issue and previously with the Craig Thompson interview has informed so much of what's happened since with the prosecutions and so on. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, but that recognition hasn't come to you. And I suspect that if you had been working at the time for a so-called serious broadcaster, there would have been a quite different outcome.
That's precisely the point. That's a very good illustration of the problem. And the problem is that we have allowed an important civic institution, that's the media, to operate in a way where its determinations, its directions, its reportage is influenced by feeling and opinion. And we've not challenged people. We haven't said to Mark Scott, the editor-in-chief of the ABC, Mark, you haven't done a single report on what has to be one of the singularly most important happenings in political history for some time, and that is the execution by police of a search warrant that named a serving Prime Minister and that sought and, in fact, got documents that police now allege were created in the furtherance of fraud by that person, naming her. How the supposed independent, impartial organisation funded for the purpose of presenting Australian news could, one, miss the obvious evidence that thing had happened, and two, when the evidence is overwhelming and presented in front of it, believe it can get away with not reporting it. And we just, the television shows, the 7:30 report, the project on Channel 10, radio, ABC, just accept it. Just say, yeah, but that's because she's, she has been attacked as a woman, and just go easy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I personally am at a loss to understand the ABC's position and approach to this.
And how do we hold them to account, Hedley?
On the face of it, I find it almost indefensible. But as I said, I don't understand what their counter-argument is. I've never seen it.
I think, just before you move off your point there, I think that's a really important bullet point from which things can progress. And it's to say this, that, look, here is an unmistakable and irrefutable instance of the ABC operating in circumstances where whatever process is set up to regulate its execution of its charter, in other words, the duties of its board, its governance, the legislation, etc., whatever set up there has failed monumentally. Because here's this continuing newsworthy event that has been studiously avoided by the ABC, and not one of the mechanisms in place to regulate its conduct has picked that up.
Well, I was trying to imagine what would be the case if a public-funded national broadcaster in the United States failed to report anything at all for the best part of a year in relation to an ongoing police investigation into a former president, or involving a former president of the United States, and that investigation included the execution of a search warrant of that former president's office, the removal of several hundred documents,
exactly, yep,
and then a number of court appearances where the police wanted to have direct access to those documents, because in their view they were created in the furtherance of a fraud. So I was trying to imagine what would happen elsewhere with something like this, and whether there would be widespread concern that a national broadcaster had completely failed to report anything about it. And it's almost impossible to make up this scenario, but it's true.
It's absolutely true, Hedley, and the fact of the response to it in various quarters, like, mine was vigorous, enthusiastic, searching for information, ringing up a lot of people, trying to get the story. That's my response. The ABC's has been to conceal it, to pretend it didn't happen, and if it did, then it couldn't possibly be about Miss Gillard because they have an opinion about her, and it doesn't fit their opinion. Now, all of that water under the bridge, I tell you what I would do, mate, if I had every significant media commentator in the country individually reporting to me, by crikey, they would be on the carpet. And these performance shortcomings, not a subjective sort of analysis about opinion and shit like that, but you missed this. This is a major story, which is right in your patch. You're a pivotal player in a major civic institution and you're stuffed up. You've missed this. That's your first warning, you know. We really do need to get a lot more serious in understanding that performance in the civic institution of the media, the fourth estate, performance doesn't mean just meeting EBIT targets, or in the case of the ABC, spending marginally less than you're allocated by the feds. Performance means a lot more than that. Performance means uncovering the news that is able to be uncovered and not turning up to work for remuneration on the basis of your magnificence and the worth of your opinion, whatever it is. You know what I mean? It's got a hard edge to it, news gathering, and it's a really important civic function, and it's not... I know I'm sort of raving a bit, Hedley, and I didn't want to use you as a backdrop for a speech, but can I just give you one little anecdote? Would you mind? I had a copper here in this room where I'm talking to you from now, and he's very senior, and we were talking about the potential scenarios that might attend the wash-up of the AW criminal prosecutions, you know, who is possibly in the slot, who's not, who might have serious charges to answer. And we got musing about the, on the face of it, the injustice of people who could engineer circumstances such that they don't fall within criminal bounds of criminal liability, you know. And I said, geez, that stings. It must really hurt you as a copper, mate, to see the behaviour, but then no, you're not going to ping him. You know what he said immediately? He goes, yeah, but isn't that your job, the media? Aren't you there to investigate those things and report them and allow the public to make an informed sort of opinion about what genuinely went on? And I looked at him and said, yeah, that's exactly the design. That's precisely what... So when they don't, when we don't, it's not like a amorphous event where, oh gosh, Australia has failed to produce an individual with the intellect and logic to fill this little gap there. It's actually people who are employed, you know, and you could name them, who should be on the carpet in front of their bosses, giving an account of how they missed it and why. And Mark Scott should be first amongst those.
Well, you mentioned before, you know, your concern about how these issues hadn't been uncovered, how the journalists from that organisation hadn't gone out and done this and that. And that point is true and relevant in relation to much of what was happening last year. I accept that. But this year, where there have been actual public court appearances, which have somehow eluded the attention of anyone at the ABC, apart, as I understand it, from some fairly brief disparaging commentary on a radio program, is more baffling. I mean, you know, courts are the bread and butter of media organisations, particularly those as well funded and resourced as our national public broadcaster. And court appearances involving very senior police involved in a long-running and very serious fraud investigation revolving around slush fund, the then and now former Prime Minister of Australia, her former boyfriend, allegedly corrupt union boss, would have thought, be right at the top of every news list. But it appears that not only did they not make the news list, they never ever made even the news. And I don't understand those news judgments. I don't understand the...
You don't have to, Hedley. You don't have to understand it. You see, this is a trap, I think, that managers in organisations sometimes fall into, and that is to spend a lot of time on an irrelevance. Like, I don't understand their motivation. I'm trying to get inside his head. I couldn't nearly said a bad word, but in the case of Mark Scott and this unmistakable incident, you don't want to make it broader. You don't want to make it thematic or reflective of a philosophy or a side. You want to make it small and specific and entirely measurable, and you want to get him on the carpet and say, Mark Scott, on the 15th of May, a warrant was issued. It was capable of discovery by many journalists who did. It was executed. It was fully executed by the 17th, 2 days later. There were eminently observable events, and you, as the bloke with the largest workforce of journalists in Australia, even after you screwed up by not getting it when it first happened, when the court appearances, etc., took place, and there was advance notice, somebody's refused to cover it, you, old mate, have got 30 seconds to explain yourself, and if it's not satisfactory, the exemplary nature of what's about to happen to you ought to resonate loud and clear across the whole country. You're getting sacked. You're gone. And you're gone because of your failure to cover this particular instance. You know what I mean? I mean, it's that serious to me.
Well, Mark, I think the effect of failing to actually cover these things to a large audience is that the status quo, or the prevailing and quite ill-informed wisdom, is unchecked and remains the so-called factual
Exactly.
scenario. And so that means that the position that you and others have been put into, where you're, I think, mocked and lampooned quite often by people who should know better and should have the facts at their disposal, becomes potentially more entrenched, because very relevant information has not made its way into the public arena. But if it did, it would have very strongly supported, in fact, vindicated your position and the reporting that has taken place, and should have concerned and alarmed many people who can see what has happened in relation to attempted media regulation as well.
Mate, there's a couple of mixed points here. And one is the satisfactory conduct of the AWU matter, its investigation, it going through the court and being exposed and all of that. I've got faith that's happening. That will happen. But the more important one, with the greater implications, and the reason that I said at the start of this conversation that the most important thing people will read today is your piece, your opinion piece about Gillard's actions. The more important issue, the bedrock issue, is we have police, we have the criminal law, and in order to secure the conversion of an innocent person to a criminal, with all the sanctions associated with that, the hurdle's so high. It's very, very high. And you've got to have proof beyond reasonable doubt. But that we know what it is. It's got police forces and lawyers and stuff like that. We also have this sort of grey institution that's malleable and able to have its opinions influenced in a bit of a herd sort of mentality, and that's the media. And in homogenising it and respecting the mainstream, even the use of that word, the mainstream opinion is the valid one, that's the right one, in shepherding the media herd in that fashion, over time we've ostracised the outliers and we've forced them to either moderate their views or to exit the stage. And in doing that, like Mark Scott, for example, is a really good example, because he gave a speech to the Sydney Institute within a couple of weeks of being appointed to the ABC job in his first term, and identified all the things that an independent observer now would point to as being emblematic of failure and the ABC's culture overwhelming its output, the groupthink type stuff. He knew all the problems. He just couldn't find it in himself to fix them, and he wasn't assisted to do that by bosses that said, Mark, here's the things you should have been doing during this time, and you haven't. It's a failure of performance. And that's a really singular point. You know what I mean, Hedley? It's a big thing to stand up and say, our media has failed, and it hasn't failed because of some systemic, institutional, discriminatory bias against journalists as a class. It's failed because the following 12 people screwed up, and I'm going to name them, and they should be sacked. They didn't report things that ought to have been reported. Is that sort of clear what I'm enunciating?
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to pretend to know why things haven't happened.
You don't have to.
And, who is directly and indirectly responsible. I'm not going to go there, but I'm concerned about the ongoing, if not, certainly a failure. I don't know whether it's a witting failure or a failure born of competence. But I wrote that piece today because it was, I think, timely in an analysis of some of the legacies of the Julie Gillard, Kevin Rudd Prime Ministership, and because I'm, I suppose, able to sort of remove myself from so-called groupthink and try to be as independent as I need to be as a journalist for the Australian, and it just has been sticking in my craw for some time. Every time I read, hear, watch a speech about press freedoms and so on, that one of the worst assaults on press freedom has actually been encouraged by many of my colleagues.
Yes, yep.
By their craven cowardice in this matter.
Hedley, can I finish with a little anecdote?
Another one.
Yeah, it's mate. The parable is the best way to illustrate a point and to illuminate, thinking and conveying messages and stuff. There's a Liberal Party politician, a minister now. It's not a huge field to choose from. I've known him for years, and I said to him, the greatest problem I reckon you guys face in the Liberal Party and your movement, it's that you play on the battlefield that's set out by the Labor people. You play on their battlefield, their media delineated battlefield. You play to their rules. And in the specific case of your opposition creating an impression that you, Liberal politicians, you're connected with big business, you're funded by Big Gina Reinhardt, etc. You appoint your mates to every position available. You stack boards. You tete-a-tete with media proprietors. The leftist movement has created that sort of impression perfectly, to the extent that the Tories, the Conservatives, don't appoint anybody who's like-minded. Don't even edge towards the sort of... Obviously there'd be exceptions, but in the main, they don't systemically edge towards those sorts of decisions where allegations like that could be made against them. So they end up with all of the reputational downside, all of the erosion of confidence in the decisions that they make, and perceptions of, poor motives underlying those. They get all the downside and they get none of the upside. Whereas the other side, the Labor side, is never questioned for its systemic patronage and implied obligation and networks and expectations that fellow travellers will make decisions in a way that's consistent with the broader decisions of the broader movement. What that has resulted in is a narrowing of the range of acceptable responses in any given circumstance where some challenge faces our community. And here's, this will be hurtful to the man, and he's my, not a good friend, but he's a friend. It's Malcolm Turnbull that I'm talking about. Malcolm Turnbull is so conditioned as a person by that phenomenon that when presented with the sort of evidence of Mark Scott failing to do his job on this AWU issue, Turnbull jumps immediately reflexively to his defence. Oh, we can't interfere. We've got to have, if this is the way that Mark feels on these issues, then this is the process working. It's not. This is a reflection of the...
Yeah, I don't know what Malcolm Turnbull's done on it, but I do differ with you. I think both sides of politics are perfectly capable of distorting, corrupting, stacking boards.
Mate, I know I'm both. You're right. You're right, Hedley.
I disagree with you that it's a one-sided affair in that regard.
Hedley, now hang on a sec. One side of it has it in its DNA. The union movement has solidarity forever. It has an expectation that one out, all out. That if you scab and act independently, you're ostracised from the movement. The movement's basic structures are set up on voting blocks and, okay, if I've got to this position, you all vote in concert with me or we cease to exist. Now, the Liberals don't have anything like that on their side. Both are capable of corrupt decisions, there's no doubt about that, but one side is systemically set up for patronage.
Well, it's probably a debate for the ages.